In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where lawns were trimmed to perfection and mailboxes were painted in matching shades, the Homeowners Association prided itself on order. Every blade of grass had to be cut to regulation height. Every trash can had to be rolled back into garages by dusk. And every house, no matter how unique the people inside, had to look almost identical from the street. This neighborhood wasn't just about living. It was about appearances. And at the center of it all was the HOA board, a small group of residents who believed their vision of beauty outweighed the individual rights of homeowners. For most people, this meant repainting shutters when told, or swapping out a flower bed if the colors weren't considered tasteful. But for one homeowner, the problems went far deeper. His name was Michael, a quiet, tech-loving resident who enjoyed his space, his garden, and his satellite television. For years, the small gray dish mounted neatly in his backyard gave him access to his favorite channels, sports, and international news. It never hurt anyone. It never disrupted the view. But one morning, tucked between glossy flyers about upcoming community events, Michael found a letter that would change everything. The HOA had ruled that satellite dishes were unsightly objects and must be removed from all properties within 30 days. The letter was written in the cold, bureaucratic tone of enforcement, with bold capital letters underlining the warning: failure to comply may result in fines of up to $500 per week. At first, Michael thought it was a mistake. His dish wasn't facing the street. It wasn't on the roof. It sat quietly in his backyard, hidden behind a row of sunflowers and rose bushes. But the HOA wasn't interested in reason. They had decided satellite dishes, no matter where they were, ruined the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood. The timing couldn't have been worse. Michael had just renewed his satellite subscription, and unlike his neighbors who streamed everything online, he relied on the dish for work as much as entertainment. He worked in tech consulting, where global news and real-time broadcasts mattered. Removing the dish wasn't just about losing TV, it was about losing a tool he depended on. At first, Michael tried to appeal the decision. He sent emails to the HOA board explaining that his dish was not facing the street and did not violate any existing rules before this sudden announcement, but his emails went unanswered. When he attended the next HOA meeting, his concerns were brushed aside. One board member, a woman known around the neighborhood for her obsession with control, smirked as she read the new rule aloud. Her argument was simple: satellite dishes are ugly, and we don't want ugly things in our community. The dismissal stung. Michael felt powerless, cornered by people who believed their preferences carried the weight of law. He knew most of his neighbors didn't care about his dish, but fear kept them quiet. Nobody wanted to be the next target of fines or harassment. With the 30-day deadline looming, Michael walked his backyard at night, staring at the dish. To him, it wasn't ugly. It was a practical tool, a small piece of metal that connected him to the world. Why should it be torn down just because someone on the board didn't like the way it looked? And that's when the idea first began to form. Instead of removing the dish, what if he transformed it? What if the very thing they called ugly became something they couldn't easily attack? He didn't know how just yet, but he felt a spark of rebellion. The HOA thrived on obedience, on residents bowing their heads and complying. But Michael wasn't ready to give in. For the next week, he researched. He looked up stories of people resisting HOAs, creative ways homeowners had bent the rules, and loopholes in property restrictions. And in the middle of his late-night browsing, he stumbled upon something that made him stop scrolling. It was a photo of a metal garden sculpture shaped like a giant sunflower, its circular center bold and bright, surrounded by curved petals that reached for the sky. Michael stared at the picture and then at his dish. The size, the shape, the frame, everything lined up in his head. The HOA said his dish was ugly, but what if it wasn't a dish anymore? What if it was art? That single thought lit the fuse. Over the next days, Michael began sketching designs. He measured the dish, noting every curve, every angle. He imagined petals made of lightweight metal, painted in bold yellows and oranges. He pictured the center transformed with texture and detail, blending seamlessly into a sculpture that looked like it belonged in a botanical garden rather than a suburban backyard. The more he planned, the more he smiled. This wasn't just about keeping his dish, it was about turning the HOA's own rule against them. After all, they banned unsightly satellite dishes, but nowhere in their rules did it say anything about sculptures, garden art, or decorative yard features. The countdown ticked on. 20 days left, then 15. Every free hour he had, he dedicated to gathering materials, ordering paint, and preparing his tools. A few neighbors noticed the deliveries and asked what he was building. Michaels only smiled and said, "Just a little project." Meanwhile, the HOA board continued sending reminders, each one sharper than the last. The final notice came with a clear threat. Inspectors would begin property checks after the 30-day deadline, and non-compliance would trigger immediate fines. But by then, Michael wasn't worried. He was motivated. He wasn't just going to comply, he was going to make a statement so bold that the entire neighborhood would take notice. On the eve of the deadline, as the sky turned orange with sunset, Michael stood in his backyard and admired the work he had poured himself into. The dish was no longer a dish. It had become something else entirely. Something beautiful, something defiant, something the HOA could not have prepared for. And as the first rays of dawn approached, he knew the battle with the HOA had only just begun. The morning after the deadline, the neighborhood stirred awake under a bright, cloudless sky. Lawns were watered, sprinklers hissed across driveways, and the smell of fresh coffee wafted from open kitchen windows. It was a picture-perfect suburban scene, the kind of morning the HOA board loved to brag about, until whispers began to spread from yard to yard. Michael's backyard, once just another patch of green, now hosted something unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. Rising tall and brilliant, gleaming in the sunlight, stood his creation, a giant sunflower sculpture with a radiant yellow face and bold orange petals. Its round center tilted skyward, the dish hidden perfectly beneath layers of vibrant design. From the street, it looked less like a satellite dish and more like the centerpiece of a public art exhibit. Neighbors slowed their walks to stare. Some gasped, others chuckled, and a few even clapped quietly when they thought no one was watching. In a neighborhood where conformity ruled, Michael's sunflower stood out as both beautiful and rebellious. The transformation was flawless. Every petal had been cut, shaped, and painted to perfection, with careful shading that made the flower appear almost lifelike. The base of the dish had been disguised with thick green stems, crafted from PVC piping and wrapped in textured paint to mimic stalks. From a distance, it looked like a massive plant rooted right into the earth. Michael watched from his back porch as the first crowd gathered. Neighbors who rarely spoke to one another lingered in small groups, craning their necks over fences to get a glimpse. Children pointed excitedly, tugging at their parents' sleeves, while teenagers snapped photos on their phones. The sunflower became the talk of the block before noon. Word spread quickly, and by the afternoon, residents from several streets over had walked past just to see it for themselves. Some even stopped to compliment Michael on his art project, though he kept his explanations vague, simply nodding and thanking them. But not everyone was impressed. When the HOA president, the same woman who had dismissed Michael's appeal weeks earlier, arrived at the scene, her expression twisted with fury. She was known for her strictness. Neighbors often whispered that she treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. Now she stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring at the sunflower as if it were a personal insult. In her mind, Michael's sculpture wasn't art, it was defiance. By the evening, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. Flyers were distributed to announce that decorative lawn features were now under review. But their problem was clear. Nothing in the current rules specifically prohibited sculptures, and nothing labeled yard art as unsightly. For years, residents had been allowed to place small fountains, garden gnomes, and seasonal decorations without restriction. The sunflower, while massive, technically fell into the same category. Michael had found the loophole. The next morning, a new letter arrived in his mailbox. It wasn't a fine, it wasn't an order for removal. It was a notice of investigation, stating that the HOA would be reviewing the sculpture for compliance with neighborhood standards. The letter dripped with passive-aggressive phrasing, calling the sunflower excessive and potentially disruptive to community aesthetics. Michael smirked when he read it. The HOA wasn't threatening fines because they couldn't, at least not yet. While the board scrambled to draft new rules, Michael's sunflower took on its own life. Neighbors started posting photos online. A local gardening blog featured the sculpture in a short article, praising its creativity. By the end of the week, strangers were driving through the neighborhood just to catch a glimpse of the giant sunflower house. The attention only fueled Michael's determination. What had started as a desperate act of defiance was turning into something bigger. He hadn't just saved his dish, he had made a statement that resonated with others who were tired of rigid rules and unnecessary restrictions. But the HOA was relentless. The board president, embarrassed that her ugly dish crusade had backfired so spectacularly, doubled down. Rumors spread that the board was planning to propose a new bylaw banning all large-scale lawn ornaments at the next community meeting. Some neighbors whispered that they admired Michael's courage, but few dared say it out loud. Fear of retaliation kept most silent. Michael wasn't surprised. He knew how HOAs operated, through intimidation, fines, and the threat of legal action. But he also knew something they didn't. According to federal law, satellite dishes under a certain size were protected by regulations, meaning homeowners had the right to install them regardless of HOA interference. The board had hoped to bully him into submission before he learned the truth. By disguising the dish, Michael had not only protected himself legally, but also forced the board to reveal how far they were willing to go to maintain control. As days turned into weeks, the sunflower became a symbol. Children stopped to pose in front of it for photos. A neighbor 2 streets away painted a small sunflower mural on her fence in solidarity. What began as one man's fight to keep a dish had quietly become a rebellion against the HOA's overreach. But rebellion always comes at a price. The board's frustration grew with every passing day. Their authority was slipping, and they knew it. At the next HOA meeting, whispers filled the room as residents waited to hear the board's decision. The president's voice cracked with anger as she announced that new restrictions would soon be voted on, restrictions that could force Michael to remove the sunflower or face steep fines. Michael sat silently in the back of the room listening. His sunflower wasn't just a decoration anymore. It was a challenge, and he knew the battle was about to escalate. Because the HOA wasn't finished. They were preparing for war. The HOA meeting ended with tension thick enough to choke the air. Neighbors shuffled out in silence, some shaking their heads, others whispering under their breath. But no one dared confront the board openly. Fear had been carved into the culture of the neighborhood over years of enforcement. The sunflower had cracked that fear, but the board wasn't about to let it shatter entirely. Within days, new drafts of community standards began circulating. The language was vague, but carefully engineered to target Michael. Terms like oversized decorative structures, non-traditional yard art, and objects drawing unusual attention appeared on nearly every page. The message was clear. The sunflower wasn't welcome, and the HOA would bend its own rules until it could justify tearing it down. Michael received his copy in the mail, stamped with the HOA's seal. He read the packet from start to finish, noting how broad the language had become. By their definition, even a large bird bath or holiday inflatable could be considered non-compliant. It was overreach at its finest, disguised as an attempt to maintain harmony. But something about this time was different. Instead of quietly folding, some residents began to push back. One neighbor, a retired teacher, pointed out that her collection of garden gnomes could fall under the new restrictions. Another worried about her seasonal Halloween decorations, which often included elaborate displays. What started as an attempt to target Michael began to ripple outward, affecting everyone. The board hadn't expected that. Their strategy relied on isolating homeowners one at a time. But the sunflower had already shifted the balance. Neighbors who once kept quiet began muttering about unfair rules and power grabs. A few even confided in Michael, admitting that they admired his refusal to cave. Still, admiration didn't stop the board. They announced a vote on the new restrictions, set for the following week. The outcome would decide the sunflower's fate. In the days leading up to the vote, Michael prepared himself. He wasn't just fighting for a sculpture anymore. He was fighting against the principle of control. He dug deeper into HOA law, studying federal protections for satellite dishes, reading cases where homeowners had successfully pushed back against overzealous boards. He printed documents, highlighted passages, and prepared to present them if necessary. But he also knew the board didn't care about legality. They cared about dominance. And they were about to make this personal. On the morning before the vote, Michael woke to find a notice taped to his front door. It was an official warning of violation, claiming that his sunflower sculpture violated existing height restrictions for lawn structures. The notice threatened fines if the sculpture wasn't removed within 10 days. Michael laughed bitterly. He had measured carefully when building it, ensuring the sunflower stayed within the allowed limits. The warning was nothing more than a scare tactic, designed to rattle him before the meeting. But instead of rattling him, it steeled his resolve. That evening, he walked the neighborhood, speaking quietly with residents who had shown support. Some admitted they planned to skip the vote, too afraid to go against the board openly. Others said they would attend but likely abstain. Only a few promised to stand with him, their voices hushed as if the board might be listening from behind the hedges. Michael realized he couldn't count on a wave of support. If he wanted to win, he had to be prepared to stand alone. The night of the vote arrived. The community center filled with folding chairs and the murmur of residents who had been pulled away from their comfortable routines. At the front of the room, the board sat at a long table, their expressions cold and unreadable. The president, with her usual air of superiority, shuffled papers and prepared to speak. The meeting began with formalities, but everyone knew why they were there. When the proposal for new restrictions was read aloud, the language sounded deceptively harmless. A push for neighborhood consistency, a way to preserve property values. But beneath the carefully chosen words was the heart of the matter. The board wanted the power to decide what was art and what was unsightly. When the floor opened for comments, silence filled the room. Residents glanced nervously at one another, waiting for someone else to speak. Finally, Michael stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. Instead, he calmly explained the truth. The sunflower wasn't just decoration, it was also a satellite dish, protected by federal law. He held up printouts of the regulations, citing the specific clauses that prohibited HOAs from interfering with the installation or use of satellite equipment. His words were measured, but every sentence carried weight. The room shifted. People who had been indifferent suddenly perked up, realizing the board might have overstepped more than they thought. Whispers spread through the audience, and even a few board members exchanged uneasy glances. But the president refused to back down. She dismissed Michael's explanation as irrelevant and insisted the sculpture still violated aesthetic standards. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted in the minds of residents. For the first time, they were questioning the board's authority. The vote proceeded, tense and divided. Ballots were cast, counted, and announced. The new restrictions passed, but only by a narrow margin. Nearly half the residents had either voted against them or abstained altogether. It was the smallest victory the board had ever scraped by with, and it left them visibly unsettled. Michael knew what it meant. The sunflower wasn't safe, but the board's grip on the neighborhood was slipping. Their power was built on the illusion of unanimous control, and that illusion had just cracked. As the meeting ended and neighbors shuffled out into the cool night air, some paused to quietly nod at Michael. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. He had stirred something they hadn't felt in years: courage. Back at home, Michael sat on his porch and looked at the sunflower glowing faintly under the garden lights. The board might have won this round, but their desperation had exposed them. And he knew they would try harder now. They had tasted defiance, and they weren't about to let it spread. The real fight was only beginning. The week after the vote, the neighborhood was different. It wasn't just the sunflower anymore. It was the atmosphere. Conversations that used to revolve around lawn care and school schedules now carried an undercurrent of rebellion. People questioned the board's authority in hushed tones, afraid of being overheard, but the unease was spreading. The HOA had won on paper, but everyone knew the victory was fragile. The board, however, was not willing to let cracks widen. They needed to reassert dominance, and they had a new plan. On a Monday morning, Michael awoke to the sound of footsteps crunching across his front lawn. He peered out his window and saw two men wearing clipboards and reflective vests. They weren't landscapers. They were HOA-appointed inspectors, sent under the guise of enforcing community standards. They moved slowly around his property, jotting down notes, measuring distances, and snapping photos. Michael stepped outside, keeping his composure. The inspectors didn't speak to him. They didn't need to. Their job was intimidation. After half an hour of silent scrutiny, they left without a word, leaving behind only the uneasy silence of a targeted homeowner. 2 days later, a letter arrived. The inspection had identified multiple potential violations, including excessive lawn ornamentation, non-standard paint application, and yard clutter. Michael shook his head. The claims were absurd. His lawn was immaculate, his paint was neutral, and his yard had fewer decorations than most of his neighbors. The message was clear. This was retaliation. But retaliation had its risks. When Michael mentioned the inspection to a few neighbors, their reactions weren't what the board expected. Instead of falling in line, people grew angry. If they could target Michael's sunflower, What stopped them from targeting a neighbor's bird bath or someone else's seasonal display? The fear that once kept everyone quiet began to backfire. Still, the board pressed forward. They issued Michael a formal compliance deadline for removing the sunflower, claiming it violated the newly passed restrictions. He had 30 days to comply or face escalating fines. Michael didn't flinch. He filed a formal appeal, citing federal satellite dish protections once again. But he knew appeals took time, and time was exactly what the board wanted to weaponize. Every delay, every notice, every fine was meant to exhaust him until he gave up. But Michael had no intention of giving up. If the board wanted a fight, he would give them one, and not in secret this time. He reached out to the gardening blog that had covered his sunflower weeks earlier. He shared the story of the HOA crackdown, the inspections, and the retaliation. Within days, the blog posted an update, and the story began spreading through social media. The Sunflower Dish Rebellion, as one headline called it, caught the attention of a local news outlet. Soon a reporter was standing in Michael's driveway, filming a segment about a homeowner's battle against an overreaching HOA. The news segment aired on a Thursday evening, showing Michael's sunflower in all its golden glory, while Michael calmly explained the situation on camera. He didn't rant or rage. He spoke plainly, emphasizing his rights and the importance of creativity in a neighborhood drowning in uniformity. The fallout was immediate. Cars lined the street that weekend, families pulling over just to take photos of the sunflower they'd seen on TV. Neighbors who had once avoided Michael now greeted him warmly, thanking him for standing up to the board. The sculpture had transformed from a private rebellion into a community landmark. But the HOA was livid. The president issued a statement accusing Michael of misrepresenting the HOA's intentions and seeking personal attention at the expense of community values. But our words rang hollow. People had seen the sunflower with their own eyes. They knew it wasn't an eyesore. If anything, it was the most beautiful thing in the neighborhood. That didn't stop the harassment. More inspectors showed up, sometimes twice in a single week. They cited imaginary infractions, a trash bin left an inch out of place, a garden hose stretched too far across the lawn, a mailbox needing fresh paint. Michael documented everything, taking photos, recording dates, and saving every notice in a growing binder of evidence. He knew harassment when he saw it, and he was building a case. Meanwhile, the sunflower continued to thrive. Michael added small touches around it, a ring of marigolds, a stepping stone path, and solar lights that illuminated the petals at night. What was once a functional disguise had become a centerpiece of his garden, radiating warmth long after the sun went down. The neighbors noticed. Some even started adding their own statement art in subtle ways. A brightly painted birdhouse here, a whimsical windmill there. It was small, but it was rebellion. The HOA's iron grip was loosening, not tightening, and every new splash of color was proof. The president of the HOA, however, saw only one thing: a loss of control. Her authority was slipping, her board divided, and her neighborhood no longer silent. Michael had embarrassed her, defied her, and now made her look powerless on a public stage. And so she escalated once more. A new notice arrived at Michael's door, this one more severe than any before. It wasn't just about the sunflower. It claimed his entire property was now under review for covenant violations and threatened legal action if he continued to resist. The language was sharp, designed to frighten. But instead of fear, Michael felt something else: resolve. He had endured the inspections, the notices, the threats, and now the legal intimidation. He had the law on his side, the neighborhood slowly shifting behind him, and the media paying attention.
The board had overplayed their hand. As Michael sat on his porch that night, the sunflower glowing softly in the darkness, he realized the battle was reaching a breaking point. The HOA had turned this into a war of attrition, but wars of attrition can't last forever. Something had to give, and when it did, the entire neighborhood would change with it.
The letter threatening legal action changed everything. Until now, the HOA had relied on intimidation tactics, fines, inspections, warnings, but this was different. This was escalation into a battlefield of attorneys and courts, the kind of fight that could drain a homeowner's bank account. The board believed that fear of financial ruin would finally break Michael. But Michael didn't flinch. He had been preparing for this moment since the first letter demanding removal of his satellite dish. His binder of evidence had grown thick with notices, photos, and records of harassment. He had the federal protections for satellite dishes printed and highlighted, and now he reached out for backup. He contacted a lawyer specializing in HOA disputes, a professional who had spent years dismantling overreaching boards. When the lawyer reviewed Michael's documentation, his reaction was immediate. The HOA was overstepping badly. Not only was the sunflower sculpture legally defensible under art and landscaping allowances, but the satellite dish beneath it was federally protected. Any attempt to force removal could backfire into a costly lawsuit against the HOA itself. For the first time in weeks, Michael felt a wave of relief. He wasn't alone anymore. He had someone who could match the board's legal threats with strength of his own. But the battle wasn't confined to paperwork. As word spread of the HOA's threat of legal action, the neighborhood atmosphere shifted again. People began to choose sides more openly. On one end were those who believed Michael's sunflower represented freedom and creativity, a symbol of resisting unnecessary control. On the other were the board loyalists, mostly a small circle, who feared that if Michael got away with it, chaos would follow. The divide grew sharper each day. Neighbors who once waved politely now crossed the street to avoid confrontation. Social gatherings turned into tense debates, whispers of the sunflower case slipping into every conversation. What began as one man's fight had become a community reckoning over who truly held power, the homeowners or the board. Meanwhile, the sunflower itself had become a destination. Strangers continued to drive by to admire it. Social media posts tagged with #sunflowerdish spread far beyond the neighborhood. Local news stations followed up with more coverage, framing the story as a modern David versus Goliath battle, one homeowner standing against a domineering HOA. The board president despised the attention. Each news story painted her as the villain, a caricature of control and pettiness. And the more the public sided with Michael, the more desperate she became to crush him. Her desperation showed in the board's next move. They announced a special assessment on the neighborhood, claiming funds were needed for legal defense against frivolous homeowner disputes. Everyone knew who they were talking about. For the first time, residents saw their HOA fees weaponized against them, not for repairs, not for maintenance, but to fight one man's sunflower. That was the tipping point. Neighbors who had stayed silent now spoke out. In hushed but determined conversations, people began rallying around Michael. A retired couple told him they were disgusted at their fees being used this way. A young family whispered that they planned to vote against the board at the next election. Even those who weren't fond of the sunflower admitted the board's actions had gone too far. The board president, blind to the shift, pressed harder. She sent another round of inspectors to Michael's property, this time accompanied by a photographer. They scrutinized every corner, searching desperately for anything that could stick. Michael documented the visit, calmly noting times and taking his own photos.
His lawyer later told him it was harassment, plain and simple. The sunflower glowed on, day after day, a silent but powerful symbol. At night, the solar lights cast golden rays across the petals, drawing more attention than ever. What was supposed to be ugly had become something undeniably beautiful, and in that beauty was defiance. The standoff reached a climax when Michael received the board's official lawsuit notice. They were suing him for violations of community aesthetic standards, seeking fines, legal fees, and forced removal of the sunflower. It was a gamble. The board was betting on intimidation, hoping Michael would cave under the weight of court proceedings. But Michael didn't cave. He countered with his lawyer's response, citing federal protections, local statutes, and his evidence of harassment. The lawsuit wasn't just weak, it exposed the board's abuse of power. If the case moved forward, it could unravel everything the president had built her authority on. As the legal wheels began to turn, the neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Would Michael win? Would the board bankrupt the community chasing its vendetta? Every passing day brought the showdown closer, and the tension was unbearable. Michael stayed calm. He kept tending to his garden, kept the sunflower polished and bright. He let the board exhaust themselves in anger while he prepared for the inevitable reckoning. The lawsuit was no longer just about him. It was about every homeowner who had ever been bullied into silence by an HOA. The board president, meanwhile, felt her grip slipping. She had poured her pride, her energy, and now her community's money into destroying Michael. But the sunflower stood, and the more it stood, the weaker she appeared. As the court date drew near, Michael sat on his porch and looked out at the glowing sunflower. He thought back to the first letter, the one that called his dish ugly. It felt like a lifetime ago. Now the ugly dish had transformed into something far bigger than he ever imagined. It wasn't just art. It wasn't just rebellion. It was the spark that could end the HOA's reign. And in a matter of days, the final battle would decide everything.
The courthouse stood tall and indifferent, its stone walls a reminder that power could be challenged and justice, if fought for, could still prevail. On the morning of the trial, the neighborhood held its breath. Some residents drove past the courthouse just to glimpse Michael walking in, while others whispered updates to one another through text chains and social media posts. The HOA had made this fight public, and now the public was watching. Inside the courtroom, the board's president sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, her face set in an expression of grim determination. She had spent months building this case, funneling community funds into legal fees, convinced that the law would bend to her will. For her, this was not about a sunflower or even about a satellite dish. It was about authority. If she lost, the illusion of her control would shatter. Michael sat calmly with his attorney, binder of evidence neatly stacked in front of him. He wasn't nervous. He had lived every moment of this battle, documented every petty inspection, every baseless citation, every letter dripping with intimidation. And today, he finally had the chance to lay it all bare. The proceedings began with the HOA's lawyer presenting their argument. They described the sunflower as oversized yard clutter and an attempt to disguise non-compliant equipment. They waved photos of the sculpture, trying to frame it as a disruption to the visual harmony of the neighborhood. Their tone was sharp, confident, until Michael's attorney rose to respond. In calm, measured words, Michael's attorney dismantled their claims. He cited the federal law protecting satellite dishes under a certain size, explaining that HOAs had no authority to interfere with their installation or use. He pointed out that the sculpture, as yard art, was indistinguishable from countless other decorations permitted in the community. And then, piece by piece, he laid out the evidence of harassment, inspection logs, contradictory notices, and the special assessment that forced neighbors to fund a personal vendetta. The courtroom shifted as the weight of the evidence sank in. What the HOA had painted as a noble defense of aesthetics began to look more like a campaign of bullying, fueled by ego and spite. The judge listened silently, occasionally raising an eyebrow as the documents stacked higher and higher in Michael's favor. When it came time for Michael himself to speak, he kept it simple. He explained how the dish had been essential for his work, how he had never intended to provoke anyone, and how the sunflower had started as a way to comply creatively while protecting his rights. He ended by saying that the sculpture had brought joy to neighbors, visitors, and even strangers who stopped to admire it. Ugly, he said softly, is not a fact. It's an opinion. The judge called a recess to review the arguments. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. The HOA president sat rigid, her face pale, while Michael leaned back, his expression calm but resolute. When the judge returned, the room fell silent. The decision was clear. The court ruled in Michael's favor. The sunflower sculpture was declared a lawful yard decoration, fully compliant with neighborhood standards. More importantly, the satellite dish beneath it was federally protected, making any attempt to force its removal illegal. The HOA's lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, and the judge ordered the board to cover Michael's legal fees, citing their actions as unreasonable and retaliatory. The verdict hit the room like thunder. Michael exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. Around him, whispers erupted, neighbors who had attended the hearing texting updates to friends and family back home. The HOA president's face twisted in disbelief. For the first time, her authority had been shattered not by whispers or defiance, but by law itself. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. Michael didn't seek the spotlight, but the story had already grown beyond him. Reporters asked for statements, and he spoke briefly, thanking his attorney and emphasizing that this was never about a sunflower alone. It was about standing up for fairness, creativity, and the right to enjoy one's home without fear. The neighborhood changed almost overnight. With the court's ruling, the board's grip on the community dissolved. Residents who had once been silent now spoke openly about years of petty harassment. Some demanded new leadership, while others began planning to remove the president altogether. Within months, a recall election was held, and the board's most controlling members were voted out. As for Michael, he returned to his garden. The sunflower still stood tall, brighter than ever, its petals catching the sunlight each morning and glowing softly under the solar lights each night. It had become more than a sculpture. It was a landmark, a reminder of what happens when one person refuses to bow to unreasonable control. Visitors continued to stop by, snapping photos and sharing the story online. The sunflower became a symbol of resistance, a reminder to homeowners everywhere that they didn't have to be powerless under the weight of unfair rules. Some even began creating their own yard art rebellions inspired by Michael's story. But for Michael, the greatest victory wasn't the attention or even the legal win. It was the quiet moments, sitting on his porch in the evening, watching the sunflower glow against the night sky. What began as a fight to protect a satellite dish had transformed into something bigger, a symbol of resilience, creativity, and community. The HOA had tried to bury him in fear, but instead, they had planted the seed of his greatest triumph, and that seed had bloomed into a sunflower that would never be forgotten.